This is Professor Luce, and today we're going to talk about introductions. With introductions, it's really critical because that is how you introduce yourself to the audience and you capture their attention. If you don't capture their attention in 30 seconds, they're done. You all probably have seen or contribute to TikTok videos, right? And the first thing they say to do is to mention you. So why is it important for you to listen to the video? You do that so that way you draw them in, you make sure that they watch the entire video, or as a viewer, you would be drawn in. Introductions are critical no matter what kind of speech you're giving. So today we're going to talk about some of the basic components to an introduction. There's going to be 2, possibly 3 components depending on the type of speech you're giving. So for your first speech, the any old bag speech, you're only going to need 2 of these components. For your informative and persuasive speech, you're going to need all 3. Let's talk about the most basic 2 at first. The first thing you do in any speech is to have an attention-getting device. The book talks about this on page 113, but there's several different things that you can do as an attention getter. And there's a range here. You can have a device and it not be that great. You can also have one of those devices and it be fantastic and really draw your audience in. We'll give you some examples here in just a second. The second component that you absolutely have to have is the preview statement, and that's on page 114. So what the preview does is it specifically identifies each main idea, giving the audience a clear idea of what's coming in the speech. So you wouldn't say, today I'm going to inform you about the history of the Detroit Red Wings. You have no idea what the main points are going to be, right? But if I were to tell you, we're going to tell you about the history of the Detroit Red Wings, starting with when the NHL was formed, second moving to the 1990s era, and then finally talking about the most recent decade. That gives you the 3 main ideas. You know exactly what the speech is going to be talking about. So let's go back to the attention-getting device. There are several different options that you have available to you. You can ask a question. You can have what's known as like a startling statement. You can give a statistic. One of my favorites is using a story. The reason I like using a story is that it has a beginning, a middle, and an end. Your speech has a beginning, a middle, and an end. So you can use the beginning of the story for the introduction, the middle of the story is part of your transitions, and then the end of the story in your conclusion again. You can be a shorter story if you want it to be, so you don't have to use that approach, but stories tend to draw people in. They're part of being a human. We're always drawn to stories. You probably have friends that are really good storytellers. And then, like my mom, unfortunately, you also probably know some people that are not so great at storytelling. Don't tell her I said that. So stories are a really good way to draw your audience in. You can tell a joke. I'm not going to say you can't do it, but it's really hard to start a speech with a joke. You don't just get up there and go, why did the chicken cross the road? To get to the other side. So today we're going to inform you how to build a treehouse. It's really, really difficult to have an attention getter that's a joke that ties into your topic. I'm not saying it's impossible. I'm just saying it can be really, really difficult to do that. If you are going to use a question, you have to be careful. There's 2 things that can go wrong. You all know the difference between a rhetorical question and a question where you want a response. This is often confusing to the audience because for you it may be a rhetorical question, but the audience may not know that, and then they give a response and it throws you off during your speech. On the flip side, if you're asking a question where you want a response, you stare at the audience, they stare back at you, you stare at the audience, and they just don't feel comfortable giving a response. So if you are going to ask a question as an attention-getting device, you want to make sure it's a good question, but you also want to make sure you know the answer. One of the best examples I can think of a bad question is a student got up and asked, all right, by a show of hands, how many of you watch professional wrestling? Nobody. Not one student raised their hand. His next statement was, well, today I'm going to tell you why you should not watch professional wrestling. The audience had tuned out. None of them watched it. So he didn't know the answer ahead of time, which means you shouldn't be asking that sort of question. So if you are going to ask a question, it needs to be something like, How many of you have shopped at Walmart in the past 2 weeks? And I'm sure that probably at least 90% of you, maybe 80%, a vast majority are going to say, yes, I've been in Walmart in the past 2 weeks. How many of you have a driver's license? A vast majority of you are going to have a driver's license. So you want to make sure that you know the answer, but you also want to make sure that it's a good segue and it's actually interesting. We talked about a startling statement. I think statistics are a good way to do that. So if I told you that 97% of statistics in the media are made up, that would be intriguing, right? It's not true, but that would be intriguing if that was true. Going now to the preview statement, that again is something super specific. This is not the time to be ambiguous with your language or have a big picture like you might be used to in English, but rather it's a time to be specific. So if you have 4 main ideas, you need to be very clear what those 4 main ideas are going to be. With your annual bag speech that's coming up, you would say, today I'm going to tell you about my squishy ball that represents my past, my mug from HGTC that represents my present, my microphone that represents my future, and my gym bag that represents my past, present, and future. See how super specific that is? It includes the objects and the time frame. You wouldn't say, you do not want to say, at any cost, today I'm going to tell you about my 4 objects and how they represent my past, present, and future. What are they? We don't know. The idea here is repetition. So, with the introduction, you're introducing the item, you talk about it during the main idea, and then in the conclusion, you talk about it again. So that makes it really simple for the audience to remember those main ideas. Why do you want that repetition? Think about how bad your memory really is. If I asked you what you had for lunch today, you could probably remember. What about lunch yesterday? Probably could remember, but maybe it's a little fuzzy. Could I ask you what you had for lunch 2 weeks ago? You're probably not going to remember. So hopefully through this repetition, it reminds your audience consistently to the point that they can remember what your main ideas are going to be. At the beginning of this video, I said there can be 3 components. So the first sentence out of your mouth is your attention-getting device. It doesn't need to be, today my name is Professor Luce, and I'm here to talk about blah, 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 blah. We'll get what you're talking about in your speech because you'll introduce it to us. So, yes, for the purposes of recording, you can say, my name is Shania Twain. Then start your speech with your attention-getting device. Out in the real world, outside of the classroom, you just start with the attention getter. You don't need to say what you're there for. The audience will already know. The second component would be a relevant statement, and that's needed for the informative speech and the persuasive speech. In the real world, it's used a lot of the time. You need to directly tell your audience why should they care. Why does this topic matter to them? So if you're going to teach us how to build a treehouse, why do we care? What's the purpose of it? If you're going to teach us how to prepare for a hurricane, well, you all may think you know about the relevance here, but it never hurts to say it explicitly. And maybe your audience already feels like they know all the information. So instead, you're going to establish relevance by providing new information that the audience doesn't likely know. And then finally, the preview statement. Those are the 3 major components of the introduction. All right, our next video, we'll talk about some other things. So that's it for introductions.